They called it garbage. Three men in tailored suits walked into a second-hand shop in Savannah, Georgia, dropped a cracked oil painting on the counter, and told the owner to throw it away. The owner, a quiet single father named Graham Ashford, said nothing. He picked up the painting, turned it under the light, and his hands went still. Something shifted behind his eyes. He set it on the easel as if it were made of glass. They had no idea they just handed him the one thing that could unravel everything they had been hiding. Have you ever thrown something away and later found out it was worth a fortune? Graham Ashford was 38 years old and lived in a narrow apartment above a shop called Second Story Antiques on a tree-lined side street in Savannah's historic district. The shop occupied the ground floor of a converted brick townhouse with a green door and windows that fogged in the summer heat. Inside, the shelves held restored furniture, old picture frames, estate jewelry, and the occasional piece of folk art that tourists bought for their vacation homes. It was not the kind of place that made anyone rich. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear. Every morning followed the same rhythm. Graham woke before the sun, made scrambled eggs and toast for his 7-year-old son Beau, packed a lunch in a brown paper bag, and walked him 6 blocks to Ardsley Park Elementary. Beau was a small boy with sandy hair and a quiet disposition that mirrored his father's, except when it came to drawing. He drew on napkins, receipts, the margins of his homework, and the paper placemats at the diner on Bull Street, where they ate dinner every other Thursday. That morning, Beau taped a new crayon drawing to the refrigerator, 2 stick figures in front of a building with a green door. Underneath, in careful block letters, "Me and Dad." Graham looked at it while tying Beau's shoes and said nothing, but his jaw tightened the way it did when he was holding something back. On the walk to school, Beau asked, "Dad, why don't we ever go to museums anymore?" Graham was quiet for half a block. Then he said, "Maybe someday, buddy," and squeezed Beau's hand a little tighter. There had been a time when Graham lived inside museums. For 6 years, he had been the senior authenticator at Hargrove Auction House in Manhattan, one of the youngest experts ever to hold that position. He had verified the provenance of paintings by Vermeer, Monet, and Cézanne. He could identify a forgery from across a room by the way the light fell on the brushstrokes. Curators called him for second opinions. Insurance firms retained him as a consultant. In that world, his name carried weight that money could not buy. Then his wife Caroline was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. She died 14 months later. Beau was 2 years old. Graham sold their apartment in Brooklyn, packed what fit into a sedan, and drove south until the road ended in Savannah. He opened the antique shop with the last of their savings. He told no one where he had come from. 5 years passed. The shop kept them fed, but not much more. Graham repaired picture frames, reglued joints on Victorian chairs, and occasionally restored small oil paintings for local collectors who paid him a fraction of what his work was worth. He never corrected their estimates. He never negotiated. He simply did the work, quietly and precisely, the way a surgeon might stitch a wound in a country clinic, without mentioning that he had once led a transplant team. In the back room of the shop, behind a curtain of old velvet, Graham kept a locked drawer. Inside was a professional authentication kit, ultraviolet lamps, a jeweler's loupe, chemical reagent strips, and a leather-bound notebook filled with dense handwritten notes on 19th-century European painters. He had not opened the drawer in over a year, but now, with the cracked painting on his easel and rent increasing, and Beau needing tuition for the Saturday art class he had been begging to take, Graham pulled the drawer open and laid the tools out on the table, with the deliberate precision of a man picking up a language he had tried to forget. He turned off the overhead light. He clicked on the ultraviolet lamp, and under its blue glow, the ugly painting began to reveal what it had been hiding for decades. 800 miles of wealth separated Graham Ashford's life from the world that had produced that painting. In a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of Whitfield Tower in Atlanta, Nora Whitfield sat at the head of a mahogany table for the first time. She was 33 years old, sharp-featured, immaculately dressed, and visibly exhausted. Her grandfather, Heiress Whitfield, had died 3 weeks earlier. He had built Whitfield Holdings from a regional real estate firm into a conglomerate worth north of $2 billion. He had also been one of the most respected private art collectors on the East Coast. His personal collection, housed in a temperature-controlled vault beneath the family estate in Buckhead, was estimated at $40 to $50 million. Nora had inherited everything. She had also inherited a boardroom full of men who did not believe she was ready. The first voice she heard that morning belonged to Preston Cade, the company's chief financial officer. Preston was 45, silver at the temples, and had served as Harrison's closest advisor for 12 years. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who had been running things long before anyone asked him to. He stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and addressed the room as though Nora were a guest at her own table. The art collection, Preston explained, had been independently appraised and found to contain limited works of distinction. He recommended an accelerated liquidation, sell everything within 90 days, and reinvest in the real estate portfolio. He had already identified a buyer willing to take the lot at a bulk discount. His tone implied that the art was a sentimental footnote Harrison had clung to in his declining years. Nora frowned. Her grandfather had spoken about that collection the way other men spoke about their children. She could still hear his voice at the dining table. Every painting in that vault has a story worth more than the frame it sits in. But Nora did not know art. She knew commercial leasing, capital structures, and debt ratios. She did not know Moreau from Monet, and the numbers Preston presented looked clean and decisive. She almost signed. From the doorway, a woman named Margaret Yuen watched in silence. Margaret was 60 years old, small and sharp-eyed, and she had served as the Whitfield family's head of household for over 25 years. She knew things about the estate that existed in no spreadsheet. When Preston finished, Margaret stepped forward and said, "Mr. Whitfield was very protective of the collection, especially the Moreau painting. He kept it closest to the door so he could see it first every time he entered the vault." Preston turned with a thin smile. "Margaret, let's not burden Miss Whitfield with nostalgia. She has real decisions to make." Margaret retreated, but her eyes stayed on the projected inventory and on the gaps she noticed but could not yet name. What no one in that room knew, except Preston, was that the painting Graham was now examining under ultraviolet light had been part of Harrison's vault until 3 months before his death. Preston had ordered it removed, along with 6 other key pieces, replacing them with reproductions good enough to fool a casual eye. The cracked painting had been sent to Graham's shop, not as a donation but as a disposal, a loose end that needed to vanish, because that painting connected directly to the original insurance manifest, the document that proved the true value of Harrison's collection. If it surfaced in the hands of anyone who understood what they were looking at, it would expose everything Preston had spent 3 years building. Preston had no idea that the man he had used as a garbage can was one of the few people in the country qualified to see what the painting really was. 2 weeks after the painting arrived at his shop, Graham carried it downtown to the Whitfield Holdings lobby. He wore his work clothes, a faded chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, worn leather boots, and hands still faintly stained with restoration solvent. He told the receptionist, politely and without urgency, that he needed to speak with whoever managed the Whitfield art collection. He said the painting they had donated to his shop might be significantly more valuable than anyone had realized. The receptionist looked at him, looked at the painting in its cracked frame, and picked up the phone with the expression of someone humoring a situation she expected to be brief. Preston Cade came down personally. He emerged from the elevator flanked by 2 junior associates, glanced at Graham standing in the polished marble lobby with the painting cradled carefully in his arms, and stopped. His expression shifted, not recognition, not concern, but calculation. He studied Graham the way a man studies a stray dog near his car, assessing whether it posed a threat or merely an inconvenience. Then his face settled into something worse: amusement. At that exact moment, Nora Whitfield stepped out of the adjacent elevator with a group of foreign investors she had been courting for a waterfront development deal in Savannah. The lobby was full administrative staff crossing between departments, a courier waiting by the front desk, 2 security guards standing near the glass doors, and a cluster of junior analysts heading to lunch. Preston gestured toward Graham and raised his voice, not shouting, but pitched with surgical precision so that every person in the lobby could hear. "This is what happens when you give things away to charity cases. They come back looking for more." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the nearest group of employees. One of the investors leaned toward Nora and murmured something dismissive in French. Another shook his head. Nora looked at Graham, a man with paint on his hands and dust on his boots, holding a cracked, discolored canvas that looked like it belonged in a yard sale, and turned away without a word. She did not defend him. She did not ask what he wanted. She simply walked toward the conference room and let the moment pass as though it had never happened. Security escorted Graham toward the exit. He did not resist. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain himself. As the guard reached for the painting, Graham pulled it back gently and said, his voice level and unhurried, "Be careful with it. It is older than this building." The guard hesitated, then stepped back and let Graham carry it out himself. Preston watched from the center of the lobby with his arms crossed and a faint smile turning the corner of his mouth. But Margaret Ewan, standing in the corridor near the service entrance with a stack of household invoices in her arms, watched too. She noticed something no one else in that lobby had seen. The way Graham held the painting not by the frame, but by the stretcher bars, fingers spaced precisely to avoid pressure on the canvas surface. It was not the way a shopkeeper held a painting. It was the way a trained conservator held one, the way someone educated at the highest professional level handled irreplaceable work. Margaret said nothing. She spoke to no one, but she memorized his face, and she remembered the name of the shop printed on the receipt the delivery team had filed 3 weeks earlier. 4 days later, Margaret Ewan walked into Second Story Antiques, carrying a leather-bound photo album that had belonged to Heiress and Whitfield. She had not told Preston. She had not told Nora. She had come alone, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, because she trusted her instincts more than she trusted the men in tailored suits who had been circling the estate since the day Harrison stopped breathing. Graham was in the back room, working under the glow of an ultraviolet lamp. The painting sat on a restoration easel, surrounded by open reference books, spectroscopic analysis printouts, and magnified photographs of brushstroke patterns. Margaret placed the album on the work table and opened it to a page near the middle. The photograph showed Harris and Whitfield younger, broad-shouldered, grinning, standing beside the same painting in what appeared to be a Parisian gallery. The painting in the photograph was uncracked and luminous. Beneath it, in Harrison's handwriting, were 4 words: "The Moreau. Never let it go." Graham studied the photograph, then turned back to the painting on his easel. He explained what he had found. The cracked, discolored surface was not the original work. It was a secondary layer of paint applied deliberately to conceal what lay beneath. Under ultraviolet light, the original brushstrokes bled through like a voice, trying to be heard through a closed door. The layering technique, the pigment composition, the way the impasto caught the light, all of it pointed to Gustave Moreau, the French symbolist master. If his analysis was correct, the painting beneath the disguise was a lost work that had not been seen since 1947. He showed Margaret the chemical sampling results, the brushstroke comparisons against documented Moreau works, and the infrared scans that revealed the underdrawing beneath both the original surface and the crude concealment layer. The evidence, he said, was substantial. Margaret sat down slowly. She told Graham what she knew. Harrison had purchased the painting in Paris over 40 years ago from a private dealer, and always called it his most treasured possession. He visited the vault almost every day just to stand before it. Preston had dismissed it repeatedly as an old man's nostalgia for a bad painting. Margaret had never believed that. Neither, it seemed, had Harrison. Meanwhile, Nora sat in a private conference room, while appraisers hand-selected by Preston walked her through the collection's valuation. The numbers were strikingly low. A Renoir sketch at $90,000, a Degas pastel at $110,000. Nora did not have the expertise to challenge the figures, but something tightened in her chest. Her grandfather had once said the Degas alone was worth more than most people's homes. She said nothing to the appraisers, but she began taking careful notes she did not share with anyone. That evening, Margaret brought Nora to the antique shop without explanation. Nora stepped through the green door and stopped. The back room was nothing like the cluttered shop out front. Graham stood at the restoration easel under ultraviolet light, wearing nitrile gloves, surrounded by books and chemical analysis reports. The painting, the one Nora had dismissed, the one Preston had called garbage, was glowing under the lamp, revealing layers of masterful brushwork invisible to the naked eye. Nora stared. Graham did not look up. He spoke without turning around, his voice flat and certain. "The painting your people threw away is a Gustave Moreau. Conservatively, 8 figures." The room went silent. Nora did not move. Margaret closed her eyes and exhaled. And for the first time since her grandfather's death, Nora understood that she had been looking in the wrong direction entirely. Nora returned to the Whitfield offices the next morning before anyone else arrived. She went directly to Harrison's personal archive, a locked filing room on the 39th floor that Preston had described as mostly outdated correspondence, and pulled the original insurance manifest from a fireproof cabinet. It took her 2 hours to cross-reference the document with the current inventory list Preston had submitted to the board. 7 works did not match. 7 entries on the original manifest, complete with photographs, provenance documentation, and independent appraisals conducted by 3 separate firms over the course of 15 years, corresponded to paintings that were no longer in the vault. In their places were canvases that looked similar in size and general color, but lacked the authentication seals. Harrison had insisted every piece carry. She confronted Preston that afternoon, carefully, without accusation. She framed it as a question of record-keeping. She asked about the discrepancies. Preston leaned back in his chair, folded his hands across his vest, and explained with practiced patience that Harrison had frequently rotated his collection, selling pieces privately, trading with other collectors, acquiring replacements, and that the insurance manifest was simply outdated. His tone carried the quiet condescension of a man who had spent 12 years being the smartest person in every room and saw no reason to stop now. Nora had no proof to push further. She let the conversation end, but she did not forget, and she did not stop looking. Preston, however, was not careless. He had survived for 3 years by reading rooms and anticipating threats. He recognized the subtle shift in Nora's questions, the specificity, the references to documents she should not have known existed. That night, he made a phone call from a prepaid phone he kept in his glove compartment. By 2 in the morning, the front window of second-story Antiques was shattered. The interior was destroyed, shelves overturned, display cases smashed, vintage frames splintered across the floor. Restored ceramics, antique woodwork, framed prints, all of it wrecked. Whoever had broken in had searched methodically, opening every drawer, slicing the backs of framed works, pulling apart storage crates. They were looking for one thing, but the painting was not there. Graham had moved it to his apartment 3 days earlier and locked it inside a climate-controlled case he had built from salvaged materials and sealed with a digital lock. He had anticipated this moment. From the instant Preston had smiled at him in that lobby, Graham had understood the kind of man he was dealing with, the kind who protected his secrets not with lawyers, but with force. The next morning, Beau came downstairs in his pajamas and stood in the doorway of the ruined shop. His eyes moved slowly across the broken glass, the overturned shelves, the shattered ceramic bowl he had painted at school and given to his father for Christmas. His chin trembled. He looked up at Graham and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Dad, who did this to our store?" Graham knelt down on the glass-covered floor, pulled Beau against his chest, and held him without speaking. Over his son's shoulder, Graham's eyes were cold, focused, and absolutely still. He knew who had done this, and he knew that going to the police would accomplish nothing against a man with Preston Cade's resources, connections, and willingness to destroy. Instead, Graham made one phone call. He dialed a number he had not used in 4 years and reached Theo Marchetti, an independent art authentication specialist based in New York, a former colleague from Hargrove and one of the foremost authorities on 19th-century French painting in the Western Hemisphere. Graham described what he had found. He sent high-resolution photographs of the painting, his ultraviolet analysis, his pigment sampling results, and his brushstroke comparisons against the Moreau catalogue raisonné. Then he hung up and began sweeping the glass off the floor. Nora arrived at the shop 2 hours later. Margaret had called her. Nora stepped through the broken doorway and found Graham on his hands and knees, picking fragments of a ceramic bowl out of the floor, the bowl Beau had painted, the one with lopsided flowers and "For Dad" written on the bottom in green glaze. He was not calling his insurance company. He was not talking to police. He was not making angry phone calls. He was simply cleaning, piece by piece, with the patience and focus of a man who had rebuilt things before and expected to do it again. Nora stood in the center of the wreckage and asked the question directly. "Did Preston do this?" Graham set the broken pieces on the counter, stood, and wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked at her and said, "Someone does not want that painting to be authenticated." His voice carried no anger, no self-pity, no appeal for sympathy. Only precision. Nora sat down on an overturned wooden crate the first time she had ever sat in a room that was not climate-controlled or interior-designed, and listened. Graham spoke for 10 uninterrupted minutes. He laid out, calmly and systematically, the evidence that Heiress and Whitfield's art collection was being dismantled from the inside. He explained that the Moreau was critical because it appeared by name in Harrison's will, with the explicit instruction, never sell this painting, stays in the family. Its removal from the vault was not a clerical error. It was a deliberate act designed to sever the one remaining link between the original collection and the insurance records that documented its true value. Every missing painting, he explained, had been replaced with a reproduction just convincing enough to pass a casual glance, but none of them carried the authentication seals Harrison had required on every legitimate piece in his collection. He opened a folder Margaret had assembled and placed 2 documents side by side on the counter. The first was the original insurance manifest, signed by Harrison Whitfield in his own hand, listing 43 works with individual appraisals totaling $47 million. The second was Preston's current inventory, 39 works valued at $11.3 million. 7 paintings were missing. Their combined appraised value exceeded $23 million. Nora stared at the numbers. Her hands trembled, but her voice held steady. "Who are you?" she asked. "Really?" Graham met her gaze and held it. "Someone who knows what that painting is worth," he said. "Nothing more." Nora proposed taking the Moreau to a major auction house for formal, independent authentication. Graham agreed, but set one condition: total secrecy. If Preston discovered that the painting still existed and was being examined by professionals, he would move to destroy it, or to discredit the authentication before it could be completed. They could not afford a single leak. As they prepared to leave, Beau came downstairs from the apartment carrying a small crayon drawing. He walked past the broken shelves and shattered glass without looking down, went straight to Nora, held the drawing up with both hands and said, "This is for you. You are the lady who came to help Dad." Nora took the drawing. It showed 3 figures standing in front of a building with a green door, 2 tall, 1 small. The small one was holding a red crayon. Nora looked at it for a long time, then folded it carefully, slipped it into her jacket pocket, and smiled, the first genuine, unguarded smile she had worn in weeks. Graham and Nora drove to Charleston 3 days later, with the painting sealed in a protective transport case in the back seat. They arrived at the Beaumont Auction House, a white-columned building on King Street that had been brokering fine art since 1891. Theo Marchetti had flown in from New York that morning and was waiting in the examination room, a windowless, humidity-controlled space lit by calibrated daylight spectrum lamps. Theo was a compact man in his early 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses, a silver beard trimmed close, and a professional reputation for being the most methodical authenticator in the country. He had once spent 14 months verifying a single Caravaggio for the Italian Ministry of Culture. He did not rush. He did not guess. And when he rendered a verdict, auction houses, museums, and courts of law accepted it without challenge. He examined the painting for 3.5 hours. He used infrared reflectography to map the underdrawing hidden beneath both the original surface and the crude overpainting. He extracted pigment samples for spectroscopic analysis. He measured the weave density of the canvas and compared it against documented Moreau works from the same period. He photographed every square inch of the surface under 7 different lighting conditions and compared the brushstroke patterns against the Moreau catalogue raisonné, the definitive reference for the artist's known body of work. When he finally removed his gloves, set down his loupe, and turned to face Graham and Nora, his expression was one of controlled astonishment, the look of a man who had spent 40 years hoping to find exactly this. The painting beneath the overcoat was titled La Chimère Endormie, the Sleeping Chimera. It was painted by Gustave Moreau in 1876 and had been exhibited once at a private salon in Paris before disappearing into a private collection. During the chaos of the Second World War, it had vanished entirely. It had not been seen, documented, or publicly referenced since 1947. Art historians had debated for decades whether it had been destroyed, stolen, or hidden. It had been hidden in Harrison Whitfield's vault, behind a layer of cheap paint that someone had applied to disguise it during transit across war-torn Europe. Theo's conservative auction estimate placed the painting's value between $9 and $12 million. It was, he said quietly, one of the most significant rediscoveries in French symbolist art in the last 50 years. Nora turned to Graham. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You knew this from the moment you saw it?" Graham nodded once. "Then why didn't you keep it?" she asked. "They gave it to you. Legally, it was yours." Graham was silent for a moment, looking at the painting at the chimera sleeping beneath decades of deception. Then he said, "Because it belongs to your grandfather's legacy, not to me." Then Theo delivered a second finding. During his provenance research, he had traced auction records across Europe and discovered that over the previous 3 years, at least 4 works from Heiress and Whitfield's collection had surfaced at private sales in London, Zurich, and Geneva. All 4 had been consigned through a shell company registered in Wilmington, Delaware, a company called Gainsford Holdings LLC. Its sole listed director, buried under 2 layers of corporate filings, was Preston Cade. Nora pressed her palms flat against the examination table and breathed. The betrayal was not a single act. It was a system. Preston had spent 3 years methodically looting her grandfather's life's work, painting by painting, sale by sale, while standing at Harrison's bedside and calling himself family. The total value of confirmed thefts exceeded $14 million, and Theo believed there were more sales that had not yet surfaced. Graham laid out a plan. The Moreau would be submitted for public auction at Beaumont. The announcement would be made through official channels. If Preston reacted and Graham was certain his response would generate the evidence needed to build an airtight case. The painting was the bait, the auction was the trap, and Preston, Graham believed, would not be able to resist trying to stop it. Nora organized the event herself. She called it a Heritage Preservation Gala, a formal review of the Whitfield art collection, held in the Grand Hall of the Whitfield estate in Buckhead. She invited the full board of directors, 2 senior art journalists, representatives from Beaumont Auction House, and a dozen industry observers. She told the board it was a celebration of Harrison's legacy. She told Preston it was a public relations opportunity. She did not tell anyone what she had found, or what was sealed inside the transport case that arrived at the estate under private security escort that morning. The evening was immaculate. Crystal lighting, a string quartet playing Debussy, champagne on silver trays. The vault had been opened for guided viewing, and guests moved between the paintings with polite admiration. Preston circulated with effortless confidence, steering every conversation toward the company's expansion away from the past, away from the vault. Midway through the evening, Nora stepped to the podium. She thanked the board and the guests. She spoke briefly about her grandfather's passion for art. Then she asked for the screen behind her to be activated. 2 documents appeared side by side, the original insurance manifest and the current inventory. 7 lines were highlighted in red, 7 paintings that should have been in the vault but were not. Preston's smile thinned, but he held composure. He stood and called the discrepancies administrative artifacts from a transitional period. He suggested Harrison had sold pieces privately without updating the paperwork. His voice was steady. His explanation was plausible enough to make 2 board members nod. Nora nodded too. Then she advanced the slide. The screen displayed transaction records from Gainsford Holdings LLC, the Delaware shell company. 4 paintings from Harrison's vault sold at private European auction houses over 3 years for a combined total of $14.3 million. The sole director of Gainsford Holdings, Preston Cade. Bank routing numbers linking proceeds to offshore accounts. Wire transfer confirmations with dates matching Preston's European business trips to the day. Preston rose from his chair, face drained of color. He raised his voice for the first time anyone could remember, calling the presentation a fabrication, an act of corporate sabotage. He turned to the board and demanded Nora be removed immediately. The journalist stopped drinking and started recording. Then the double doors at the far end of the hall opened. Graham Ashford walked in carrying the Moreau in a professional transport frame. He wore a clean white shirt, but his hands bore the permanent stains of restoration work. Beside him walked Theo Marchetti, carrying a leather portfolio stamped with the Beaumont Auction House seal. Graham walked the length of the hall in silence. Every pair of eyes followed him. He placed the painting on the display easel at the front of the room. The restored surface caught the light, rich, luminous, unmistakably the work of a master. The sleeping chimera looked out at the room with closed eyes and an expression that seemed like patience. Graham turned to face Preston. His voice was calm, unhurried, and carried to every corner of the silent hall. "You told her it was ugly. You told her it was worthless. You had your people throw it in my shop like garbage. But this painting, the one you tried to erase, is a lost Gustave Moreau worth $11 million. And the signature on the insurance fraud? It is yours." No one moved. No one spoke. Preston's mouth opened, but no words came. The string quartet had stopped playing. A journalist lowered her recording device and stared. A board member set down his champagne glass, and the soft click of crystal on marble echoed through the hall like a heartbeat. Preston lunged toward the easel. 2 security guards intercepted him before he reached the painting. He struggled briefly, then went still, breathing hard, staring at the canvas with the expression of a man watching his entire architecture collapse. The aftermath moved with the cold efficiency of institutional machinery. Atlanta police and investigators from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation arrived within the hour. Forensic accountants retained by Whitfield Holdings' outside counsel began reviewing the records that same night. The evidence was overwhelming. Email logs recovered from Preston's private server documented 3 years of detailed correspondence with art brokers in London, Zurich, and Geneva, including negotiation threads, shipping manifests, and appraisal instructions. Surveillance footage from the estate vault, footage that Margaret Yuen had quietly preserved by maintaining her security access long after Preston had tried to have it revoked, showed Preston entering the vault on 14 separate occasions carrying crated packages that appeared on no authorized inventory transfer record. Wire transfer confirmations traced over $23 million in stolen artwork through the Gainsford Holdings shell company and into accounts Preston controlled in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. The appraiser Preston had hired to produce the lowball valuation, a man named Gerald Hatch, from a mid-tier firm in Richmond, broke within 40 minutes of questioning. He admitted that Preston had paid him $60,000 in cash, delivered in 2 installments, to generate a fraudulent appraisal that would justify the bulk liquidation and mask the missing works. Preston Cade was arrested in the Grand Hall of the Whitfield estate, surrounded by the art collection he had spent 3 years systematically looting. As the officers led him toward the front door in handcuffs, he stopped and turned to look at Graham, who stood beside the Moreau with his arms at his sides and his expression entirely unreadable. "Who the hell are you?" Preston asked. His voice cracked on the last word. Graham held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He did not answer. The officers pulled Preston forward, and the heavy doors closed behind him. It was Theo Marchetti who answered the question. He addressed the room without theatrics and without embellishment, the way an expert testifies, with facts and nothing else. Graham Ashford, he explained, had served for 6 years as the senior authenticator at Hargrove Auction House in New York, one of the most prestigious art institutions in the world. During his tenure, he had verified the provenance of major works by Vermeer, Degas, Monet, and Cézanne. His most celebrated achievement was the authentication of a previously unknown Vermeer, a small domestic scene titled The Letter at Dusk, which subsequently sold at auction for $35 million. It was considered one of the most significant art discoveries of the past 2 decades. Graham had resigned from Hargrove 5 years earlier, following the death of his wife, and had not practiced professionally since. The room turned to look at Graham, board members in bespoke suits, journalists with recording devices, auction house representatives who suddenly understood why the authentication report was flawless, and Nora standing 6 feet away, her hands at her sides, tears running silently down her face. They all looked at the man in the white shirt with stained hands who had been dismissed as a charity case in the lobby of the very building his expertise had just saved from a $23 million theft. Graham did not acknowledge the attention. He looked at the painting, at the chimera, sleeping beneath layers of deception, patient and undamaged, waiting to be seen, and something crossed his face that was neither pride nor vindication. It was recognition. He knew what it meant to be buried under something that was not you, to wait in silence until someone finally cared enough to look. The Moreau was consigned to Beaumont Auction House the following week. The sale drew international media attention. Bidding opened at $4 million and climbed steadily for 11 minutes. The final hammer price was $11.2 million, purchased by a private European collector who had been searching for La Chimère endormie for over a decade. 3 months later, the weight had lifted. Interpol recovered 2 of the 4 paintings Preston had sold in Europe. The remaining 2 were under active investigation in 3 countries. Preston Cade had been indicted on 17 federal and state counts of fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud, and theft of cultural property. Gerald Hatch had entered a cooperation agreement and was providing testimony to prosecutors in Georgia and Virginia. Nora offered Graham a position as chief art advisor to Whitfield Holdings, a role created specifically for him, with a salary and benefits package that would have solved every financial pressure he had carried for the past 5 years. Graham declined. He told her he liked his life in Savannah. He liked the shop with the green door. He liked walking Bo to school in the morning and hearing the mockingbirds in Forsyth Park. He did not need a corner office to know what he was worth. Nora used a portion of the Moreau auction proceeds to establish the Heiress and Whitfield Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding art education for children in underserved communities across Georgia and the Carolinas. She named Bo Ashford as one of its inaugural scholarship recipients. On a warm Saturday afternoon in mid-October, Bo sat at a wide table in a bright studio classroom at the Savannah College of Art and Design's youth program, painting with watercolors for the first time. His tongue poked out of the corner of his mouth the way it always did when he concentrated. The light through the tall studio windows fell across his paper in long golden rectangles. Graham stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching his son work. Nora walked up beside him. They stood shoulder to shoulder, close enough that their arms almost touched, and neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Bo looked up, saw them both standing there, and ran over with wet paint still on his fingers. He threw his arms around Graham's waist, then reached out and grabbed Nora's hand, pulling her closer until the 3 of them stood together in the studio doorway. Nora laughed, a quiet, startled sound, like something she had forgotten she could do. Graham looked down at his son, then at Nora, and something in his expression softened in a way it had not in 5 years. Later, as they walked together across the campus courtyard, Bo tugged on Nora's sleeve and handed her a folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a crayon drawing 3 figures standing in front of a building with a green door. This time underneath, in his best handwriting, Bo had written a single word: us. Graham looked at the drawing. He looked at his son. He looked at the woman standing beside them in the late afternoon light. And for the first time in 5 years, he smiled in a way that reached all the way to his eyes. They did not kiss. They did not make promises. They simply walked together through the courtyard as the October light turned the old brick buildings to gold. Neither of them had been looking for each other, but sometimes the most valuable things are the ones everyone else overlooks.